Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And we talk about military doctrine, history, the practices of great military leaders, and we translate that into lessons we can use to better run our businesses, whether it's our own business or one that we work for. So today, my topic is putting your people on par with your mission. And that may sound like, well, of course I do that. But I wonder about that quite honestly. And I will say that all the years that I spent in the military, in general, that is something that the military excels at, especially the Marine Corps. So I think I've told this sort of, it's not really a story, but it's kind of a joke, if you will. But the Navy has its ships, the Air Force has its airplanes, the Army has its tanks and its howitzers and things like that, and the Marine Corps has its people. That's very much how they look at it. They're not particularly equipment focused. I mean, they certainly have Humvees and rifles and all that kind of stuff, but it's usually not the state-of-the-art equipment. It seems like in many ways they get the cast-offs from the other branches of the military. Not literally so, but in general, the Marine Corps invests most of its funds in its people. And that is why Marines are so effective at what they do. But it goes beyond just those kind of, if you will, simple aspects of how the military works. And it's built into the entire military structure. So when I joined the Navy, and I joined in 2006. And prior to that, I'd done a lot of reading about military history, in particular World War II. And one of the things that I didn't realize, and World War II was kind of where this started, is the military basically works in two parts. So at the time, and technically they're still called this, although you'll hear me refer to them as service branches. But you have what are called the military departments. Now, in World War II, there were only two. There was the Department of the Navy and the Department of the Army. And you say, well, wait, there was an Air Force in World War II. Yes, there was. The Air Force started out as the Army Air Service back in kind of World War I time period. It then became the Army Air Corps in around the 1920s and into the 1930s, and then became the Army Air Force, the AAF. And in fact, it was known as the Army Air Forces during World War II. So it wasn't until after World War II was over that the Air Force became a separate service branch or military department. And you may also say, well, wait, what about the Marine Corps? So the Marine Corps is housed, if you will, within the Department of the Navy. Okay, so and that has always been the case. It continues to be the case. Candidly, it's a source of some friction with the Marine Corps from time to time, especially if the Navy, or I should say the Navy Department, adopts a practice or a regulation without consulting the Marine Corps, because the Navy and the Marine Corps have fairly significantly different philosophies about how they do things. Nonetheless, they both inhabit the Department of the Navy. Now, if you are like me, a reader of World War II history, so you'll know that all of a sudden I went up on his name. Admiral King on the Navy side was instrumental in executing naval strategy throughout the war, as was General Marshall, so Admiral King was the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations. And George Marshall, General George Marshall, was Chief of Staff of the Army. Okay, and those are the respective heads of those two military departments. But they were also absolutely crucial in developing the strategy that the United States pursued in fighting World War II. So, having been steeped in that knowledge, I just thought, okay, well, so, that's how it works. The military departments not only do their thing, which I'll talk about in a minute, but they also direct strategy. What I didn't realize was that there was something called the Chiefs of Staff, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff is what it's called now. And it's made up of several individuals, and it's actually the Joint Chiefs of Staff that develop military strategy. And then that is conveyed to what are called the combatant commanders in whatever, area of the world a particular operation is taking place. And that sort of World War II practice developed into what we now have, which is, on the one hand, we have military departments, the Department of Army, the Department of the Navy, and the Department of the Air Force. And by the way, the Space Force, as I understand it, is part of the Department of the Air Force as well. And then we have what are called combatant commands, or unified commands. And those are separate, okay? And in fact, I'm going to share my screen so you can see a little bit about, I brought up some slides on how these various things work. So, okay, so here's basically what's called the National Command Authority for the military. So you have the president, who is, from a military standpoint, known as the commander-in-chief, okay? Now, this is by design. In the U.S. Constitution, the commander-in-chief of the military is a civilian. It is not military personnel, because the founding fathers did not want the military to ultimately be under military control. They wanted it to be under civilian control. So the military is subordinate to the president, to civilian control. Now, in general, the president delegates his authority as commander-in-chief, or not all of it, but much of it, to the Secretary of Defense. Okay, this is also a post-World War II position. A unified Department of Defense didn't exist back in the early to mid-1940s. It was created in 1949, I believe it was, under the National Defense Act, which took the Department of the Navy and the Department of the Army and put them underneath the Department of Defense. Okay, so it's generally speaking through the Secretary of Defense that the president directs military policy. Okay, now I mentioned already unified commands and military departments. Before I get into those in more depth, I want to talk about two of the things that I've already mentioned, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You notice there's a dashed line here, and that's because the Joint Chiefs of Staff advise the president, okay? And they also advise the unified commanders, okay? As the National Security Council also advises the president. But notice they don't have command authority. Okay, this right here, the reason this connection is here is because the senior military person in each of the military departments, the Chief of Staff of the Army, the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations, and the Chief of Staff for the Air Force, are all members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Okay, you notice the names are the same. So that's what goes on here. But command authority comes through the president, goes from the president through the Secretary of Defense to the unified commands. Okay, so that's what these are here. These are advisory. They advise. Command authority goes through the president. Okay, and so why do we have military departments and unified commands? Well, that's because the job of the military departments is to recruit, train, and equip personnel within their respective departments. Okay, so the responsibility of the Chief of Staff of the Army is to recruit soldiers, train them, and equip them. Okay, and same with the CNO. It's to recruit sailors, train them, and equip them. And same with the Air Force. Okay, unified commands actually execute missions. They execute defense policy, if you will, in the field. Okay, the military departments do not do that. When a unified commander needs people to execute a mission, basically he goes to the particular military department and he says, okay, I need to execute the following order on behalf of the president, and this is what I need to do it. And the military department or departments sends the unified commander the personnel and the equipment that he needs in order to execute that mission. Okay, now, and this is why I say you want to put your people on par with your mission. So unified commands are mission focused. Military departments are people focused. And notice they are on the same level. Okay, and in fact, the chiefs of the various military departments are typically a four-star flag or general officer, and that the same is true of a unified commander. Okay. All right. Now let's look at another slide here, real quickly. Wait a minute. United States. Oh, it's not showing up. Oh, here it is. Okay. All right. So let's look now for just a minute at how the Joint Chiefs of Staff works. This is the advisor. Okay. And here you see you have a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's typically one of the previous military department chiefs. Okay. And then you have a vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then here's the Chiefs of Staff. Chief of the Staff of the Air Force, of the Army, Chief of Naval Operations, and Commandant of the Marine Corps. Now, you may say, well, wait a minute. Commandant of the Marine Corps is not is not at the same level as the CNO. Technically, that's true. Practically, the Commandant of the Marine Corps has the responsibility to recruit, man, and equip Marines. Okay, so the Commandant of the Marine Corps sits on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Okay, and then you have these various assistants. Okay, and you can see assistants to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, assistants to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs for National Guard and Reserve matters. Okay, I'm not going to get into what that is, and then senior enlisted advisor to the Joint Chiefs of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Okay, so this is to make sure that these other parts of the military, enlisted, National Guard and Reserves, that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has their input. Okay, now, you'll notice here, coming directly from the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you have the director of the Joint Staff, and here's the various parts of the Joint Staff. So director of manpower and personnel, director of intelligence, operations, logistics, and we've talked about this sort of organization before in a previous show, so I'm not going to get into here. Just notice that unlike the Navy, which has what are called N shops, and the Army, which has G shops, Here at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you have JSHOPs. Okay, that's what they're known as. All right, so this is the organization then that advises the president. And you notice, again, I'm going to emphasize this, Director of Manpower and Personnel, J1. Now, in other words, number one is people. Okay, most of the rest of this is actually dedicated to mission planning and execution. Okay, but people are still number one, and it shows you that in a way this is balanced against all these other ones. Okay, so now let's look at the various combatant commands. Here we go. Okay, so when we talk about unified commands, or in particular, we talk about unified combatant commands. Okay, there's two types of unified commands. There's there's two types of combatant commands. There's unified combatant commands, and there's functional combatant commands. Okay, unified combatant commands relate basically to a part of the globe. Functional combatant commands relate, as their name says, to a function. So just real quickly, I'll cover these. U.S. Special Operations Command, that deals with what are called spec ops, special operations, okay? And those special operations can take place anywhere, okay? But this is a unified command that deals with the Green Berets, the SEALs. I believe Army Rangers are included in that. There is an Air Force Special Operations force as well. The name of it is escaping me. Okay, U.S. Transportation Command. Again, this is a function of the military to transport things. Okay, Strategic Command, STRATCOM. Okay, and then Cyber Command. Both of those I think, are pretty self-explanatory. Strategic Command is dealing with things like strategic deterrence. So things like our boomer submarines that carry nuclear missiles and go on these 89-day missions underwater. Okay, things like that. Okay, and then U.S. Space Command. Now, U.S. Space Command is actually a unified combatant command because its domain is space. Okay, all right, and then there's I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 6 unified combatant commands. There's U.S. Northern Command, NORCOM, Southern Command, SOCOM, European Command, EUCOM, Central Command, CENTCOM, Africa Command. I think it's AFCOM, and then Indo-Pacific Command. And I don't know what the what the short name is for that. Okay. And by the way, when a ship, when I was on deployment, for example, okay, we started out in Northern Command, NORCOM, because we were based in San Diego. When we crossed this line right here that you see into the Indo-Pacific Command, there's different fleets assigned to each command. So we chopped from, I think it was 3rd Fleet to 5th Fleet or something like that. And then when we went from Indo-Pacific Command into CENTCOM, we chopped into a different fleet as well. Okay, and I won't get into that too much. Only recognize that there are different fleets assigned to different commands. And as an individual ship, you can start out being assigned to one fleet, and then as you move from one combatant command to another, you actually become part of a different fleet. Okay, now why am I going through all this stuff? Well, you can see that all of these combatant commands, they are focused on executing missions within each of these areas of the world. So for most of the last almost 25 years, CENTCOM has really been the focus of activity by the United States, because CENTCOM comprises Iraq, it comprises Iran, it comprises the Middle East, it comprises Afghanistan, okay? And most of the action in terms of the military was taking place in this region, Syria, etc. Okay. Now, what's happened over the last few years is China has become a much more significant geopolitical issue for the United States. And so this is even going back to the time that President Obama was president. There was starting to be a focus away from CENTCOM and into the Indo-Pacific Command. Okay, and so there's been some tension. Maybe isn't quite the right word for it, but there's been there's a lot of discussion going on. Should we be much more focused on Indo-Pacific Command versus Central Command? Now, with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, there's renewed focus on European Command. So there's 3 areas of the world where the military, the U.S. military, has pretty significant interests in keeping track of, and that's a lot. On some level, we haven't seen this much of the world needing to be of interest since perhaps World War II. And by the way, there are troops actively deployed in Africa, different parts, Central Africa, Horn of Africa, etc. So there's some, excuse me, focus of the United States on Africa. So in a way, we have global concerns today, unmatched since World War II. Okay, so there's a lot going on from a mission standpoint. However, and I'm going to go ahead and let's see, close this out. Okay, and I'm going to go back to the National Command Authority. Okay, so all of this stuff in the unified commands is again, it's mission oriented. It's dealing with our enemies, or our geopolitical rivals, we'll call them. Okay, that all happens separate from what's going on in the military departments. Okay, so it's not that there's no interaction between the two. There's lots. However, the military departments remained focused on their 3 core purposes: recruit, train, and equip. Okay, and those go on despite what's happening on a mission level in the unified commands, or in the unified combatant commands. Now, what needs to be done on a mission basis may change who gets recruited, how they're trained, and how they're equipped. Okay, so that's the main connection here. Okay, that's how mission affects people. Okay, but as you might guess, people also affect mission. Okay, so for example, I mentioned President Obama. During his time in office, he relied very heavily on Special Operations Command for operations, especially throughout CENTCOM. Okay, and I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but that's what he did, to the point where the military departments, especially the Army and the Navy, had to really step up their recruiting, training, and equipping of things, of units like the Green Berets and the SEALs, because the unified commander in CENTCOM was constantly calling for special operations forces for various missions within CENTCOM. Okay, so but it got to the point where they just didn't have enough people, and so that's why at times missions authorized by President Obama used he started using a lot of drones and those sort of things, because there just was not enough special operations personnel to pursue all the missions. Now, it was also the case that when they realized we can use drones without endangering people, that was a better way to go. Okay, so I'm again I'm giving you somewhat of a simplified look at all of this. Okay, but again, this is the main point that I'm stressing. People are on par with mission. Okay, and in fact, the military is as devoted to training, recruiting, training, and equipping people as it is to pursuing its mission. So I would argue that that's what we need to do in our businesses. So when you think about how our businesses are organized, typically we have a CEO. That CEO tends to be very mission focused. So kind of like the president, right? The president is there to develop and execute national security policy. Okay, but there's typically the person in charge of personnel is a vice president or maybe a senior vice president. Okay, typically executive VPs are mission focused. And I think that that's a mistake from the standpoint of our businesses. I think that we need to have the person in charge of personnel, recruiting and training and equipping our personnel in business needs to be on par with whoever is the senior person, if you will, who's executing mission. Okay, so the CEO, right, needs, the CEO is essentially responsible for both, just like the president is. Okay, but we typically have a COO. Okay, and in a small business we don't have these titles necessarily, but typically we have these same kind of positions, right? The COO tends to be very mission oriented in the sense of executing on a day-by-day basis. Okay, so you see companies that have a chief people officer, a CPO, or a chief personnel officer. Okay, that those companies are putting their people on the same level as mission. Okay, or hopefully they are. Hopefully that's not just something they're doing in order to make their people feel like they're important, even though there's no real, or there's not as much muscle put in the chief personnel officer as there is in the chief operating officer. But that's what we want to do. Okay, so if the COO is, let's say, president or an executive vice president, the chief personnel officer needs to be so too. And the chief personnel officer should not be reporting to the COO. The chief personnel officer should be reporting to the CEO, just like the COO. They need to be at that same level. Okay, so the issues of recruiting and training the people in our businesses, the issue of what kind of technology is available to them, the issue of what kind of environment they work in, all of that needs to be as top a priority as executing the mission. Okay, and that's how the military runs things. And it's why, in general, there's such high satisfaction among people in the military. Now, you may hear things about how people in the military, they grumble about this or they grumble about that. That's true. They say it's a sailor's and a soldier's right to grumble. Okay, but the fact of the matter is, there is a high level of satisfaction among people in the military. It does fluctuate, of course. Sometimes it's better than others. And there are some commanders in chief that are better liked than others, and that can have an impact. There are COs of units that are better liked than others that can have a big impact on how much service members enjoy their service. But overall, there's a pretty high satisfaction level in the military. And in business, we would be wise to work to achieve that level as well. And the way we can do that is not only by demonstrating that people are on the same level of as mission in terms of the most senior person responsible for it, but actually making it so in terms of how we deal with resources, how we deal with the challenges of each. Okay, so that's our episode for today here on Business Lessons from the Military. You also got a little bit of a lesson in how the military itself is organized. So hopefully you found that interesting. I didn't know anything about this. Like I said, when I joined in 2006, this was all part of my initial military training. And it took a little while to kind of figure it all out. And by the way, I just gave you the most simplified version of it. It gets very, very complex because there's multiple layers. Some might argue there's too many layers, and of course that those are issues best discussed, I think, over bourbon and branch. So, but welcome your thoughts on this, your questions. The links to social media will be in the show notes after this episode posts. And thank you very much for joining me today. So tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. We're going to talk about building a real estate portfolio using leverage. And in fact, this is how almost all people who have built a large portfolio of real estate have done so. They use something called positive leverage. We're going to do a fairly deep dive into that. So I invite you to join me tomorrow. And then next week, Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is the next episode of Trusts and Estates Weekly. And then 7 days from today, we'll be back again for the next episode of Business Lessons from the Military. So thanks again for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and signing off. Marie, you are my belle. All the best, folks.